Hello and welcome BSCI160 students to this Unit 3 review. In this video, there will be brief reviews on the following topics. So Hadley cells, abiotic, biotic factors, allee effect, carrying capacity, food webs, and trophic efficiency. I hope that you guys can find this video helpful and then review these concepts and apply them to practice problems before the final. I wish you all luck on the final. You guys can do this. You're almost there. Keep going. Hadley cells are described as low-latitude circulations of air that rise at the equator and fall at about 30 degrees latitude. I found this image online and I thought this was a great simple way to represent Hadley cell circulation. If you all can just conjure this up during the final, then you all should do great, because it really shows the key components that we want you to take out of Hadley cells, and the fact that warm air rises at the equator and then cools and falls 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south. When relating Hadley cells to tropical weather and deserts, a key idea here is air and how much moisture the air is able to hold. When you first have that air rising at the equator and then it starts to move towards 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south, what happens is that air cools, right? Cool air is not able to hold as much moisture. Since the cool air can't hold in any moisture, the moisture is released, so water is released into the environment from the clouds, and that is why near the equator we have that typical tropical weather, rainy weather. When the air begins to fall at about 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south of the equator, this falling air starts to warm up again, and this warm air can now pick up moisture from the surrounding, and since all the moisture is being uptaken, that a word? Anyway, then everything below that becomes dry, and that is how we have deserts in these areas. Biotic factors are any living components of the environment, while abiotic factors are the non-living components of the environment, of the ecosystem. So looking at this image here, we can see that the biotic factors would be the plants in the background, those are living, as well as the elephants in this image, the cute little baby elephant, while the abiotic factor would be such things as the rock, for example. Honing in on these topics a little bit and relating it to another topic that is important in Unit 3 for this class, we can think about biotic factors and how this relates to density-dependent populations. So these are populations that are dependent on the amount of individuals in the population, so that will reach that carrying capacity. When relating biotic factors and density-dependent populations, I like to think about food and competition of resources. So when you're getting a population that is growing and growing, eventually the resources will become depleted and there'll be more competition for those resources. So this population will eventually reach its carrying capacity with a rate of 0. It can no longer grow because the environment can no longer support them. So in this example, the food that serves as the resource for the population, food is a biotic factor. Here I have inserted this really cute image of these two flamingos forming a little heart shape, and I have put this in here so that we can start talking about the allee effect. And this is this really interesting phenomenon that scientists have found in certain populations, where if a population is too small, then the population is actually not able to reproduce. The allee effect can be found in populations of flamingos, so sometimes what can be done is that plastic flamingos are inserted into the population that is too small, and so then it tricks the real flamingos to mate and reproduce because they think, oh, actually our population isn't small, look, we have all these other flamingos, but they're actually plastic. So hopefully in the future, while maybe taking the exam, you can think of these really cute flamingos forming this heart shape and associate it with the allee effect and how these flamingos need other flamingos around them in order to encourage this mating and increase of population size. Now talking about carrying capacity, we'll be looking at this graph right here that can also be found on Dr. Schaffner's slides on slide 34, lecture 20, as well as the Campbell textbook. differences between exponential growth model and the logistic growth model is, first, as you can see, the exponential growth model is more of a J shape, while the logistic growth model is more of an S shape. The key difference and what we want you guys to keep in mind when comparing exponential growth and logistic growth models is that logistic growth model is more realistic as it keeps in mind the carrying capacity of the system, of the environment. And this carrying capacity is dependent on the limiting resources of that environment. And these limiting resources can be things such as energy, shelter, refuge from predators, nutrient availability, water, and suitable nesting sites. Looking at the logistic growth equation, you see that it does have bits of that exponential growth equation, but it has that added idea of carrying capacity expressed through this portion k minus n over k. And this equation shows three really key relationships that we want you to take out of this. And the first one being that when n is small, when population is small, then compare that to the k, that means that it is increasing at its max. It makes sense that when the population is small, then this population is increasing at its maximum, because that means there's a lot of resources, a lot of space available for this population. When n is large, then that k minus n over k is nearing 0. So the increase is small because population is large, less resources, so we're having an increase that is small. And then when n is equal to k, then there is no more growth. You have reached that carrying capacity, you're at your max. A food web shows trophic relationships, so this means feeding relationships of a community. Overall, it shows who eats who. The somewhat confusing part about food webs, at least what confuses me, is if you look at this image, you see that fish eggs is pointing to sea nettle. This doesn't mean that fish eggs eat sea nettle, it means that sea nettle eats fish eggs. So maybe a better way to think about this is what's going into whose belly. So the fish eggs is going into the sea nettle's belly. Here is an image showing a pyramid of net production. And so this is also showing trophic relationships. So just like the food webs, it's showing what is going into whose belly. Camp for biology defines trophic efficiency as the percentage of production transferred from one trophic level to another. Wow, this is pretty confusing. So to break this down, for example, looking at this primary consumer, this 1000 joules is showing the energy that is not being used for respiration, for the energy lost in feces, things like that. To summarize, this pyramid in the bases, these values are showing how much energy is in the food that the organism is consuming, for that organism to then use for their own cellular purposes, for their own functioning. Before going into more detail and looking at this image further, it's important to differentiate the differences between producer, consumer, primary, secondary consumer. So producer and consumers are pretty self-explanatory. A producer can make their own food via photosynthesis, while a consumer will consume the producer because they're not able to make their own food. A way to differentiate primary and secondary consumers is to think about the relationship that this consumer has with the primary producer. So in the case of the primary consumer, there is a direct relationship with the primary producer because this consumer is a herbivore, so it is directly eating that flower. In this case, the bee is eating the nectar from the flower. While the secondary consumer doesn't have that direct relationship to the primary producer, but it's still linked to the primary producer via the primary consumer that it consumes, because a secondary consumer is either an omnivore or it can also be a carnivore. The same thinking can be applied to the tertiary consumer. Really, it just helps to look at this pyramid and think, okay, what eats what? And then the tertiary, secondary, primary consumer is a bit clearer. Now looking at these values and trying to piece everything together and make sense of this a bit more, you see here that they have 1 million joules of energy from the sun striking Earth's surface. So now this energy is used by the primary producer, But this primary producer only can use 1% of these joules for transfer to the next trophic level. The reason why the primary producer can only transfer 1% of that energy that it took from the sun is because of the reasons that are provided in lecture 25, slide 7 of Dr. Schaffner's PowerPoints, in which she mentions that most of the sunlight is actually reflected off of the earth, as well as 50% of the energy that the plant uses from the sun is used for respiration. After only 1% of the energy provided by the sun is available in the primary producer for transfer to the next trophic level, so you can see 1 million joules, 1% of that is 10,000 joules. So now those 10,000 joules are available for the primary consumer to use because it's going to eat that primary producer. So it uses those 10,000 joules, and then only 10% of those 10,000 joules, so 1,000 joules, can be transferred to the next trophic level, can be transferred from the primary consumer to the secondary consumer. This pattern of trophic efficiency continues up the pyramid, and so the pattern to keep in mind is 10% of the energy that is available will be able to be transferred on over to the next trophic level. So from the primary consumer, 1,000 joules is consumed by the secondary consumer, but they can only then transfer on 10%, so 100 joules to the tertiary consumer. So when thinking about this, there is only 10% of trophic efficiency because all the other energy that organism gained from the food that it just consumed is being used for things such as respiration, is being lost in their feces. So this is just the energy that is remaining that they can pass on to the organisms that will then consume them. It is usually due to the 90% of energy that is lost for other cellular purposes that these food webs, these pyramids, do not go past tertiary consumers, because as you see here, this tertiary consumer can only pass 10 joules on to the next level, and then that level can only pass on 10% of that, so 1 joule, and that's not a lot of energy available.